All right. So, hi, I am Darla Clayton. I am the Community Relations Specialist for the Alliance to Cure Cavernous Malformations. I am also personally affected with the CCM2 gene, and so are both of my kids. And then, aside from all of that, in my other life, I am a clinical psychologist. I am not a neuropsychologist, but most of my career has focused on testing and evaluation. So I am pretty capable of discussing neuropsychology. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about neuropsychology, the basics. So, what is it? Why does it make sense to get a neuropsychological evaluation? And what does that process look like? And then hopefully at the end, we should have some time for questions. We do have a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You should see that. And if you could use that to ask questions instead of the chat, because it's just me tonight and I can't be bopping back and forth between multiple things. So I will only look for questions in the Q&A. Hopefully at some point I will pop over to the chat and put a link to our support group, which will start right after this webinar tonight. And I think that's all my housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. This one. All right. So, starting with the very basics, what exactly is a neuropsychological evaluation? It is a comprehensive assessment of lots of different sorts of things like cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions, and it helps you gain a better understanding of brain behavior relationships. It can help you identify strengths and weaknesses in your brain functioning, and it can help clarify diagnoses and provide recommendations to help with challenges. A neuropsychological evaluation is conducted by a neuropsychologist. They are clinical psychologists with specialized training in brain behavior relationships. Often, a neuropsychologist will collaborate with some other providers on your team, like neurologists, psychiatrists, and therapists. So, why could it be helpful to have a neuropsychological evaluation? And I'm probably going to shorten that to neuropsych at some point because that's going to make me trip over my words pretty soon, I'm pretty sure. So, a neuropsych evaluation is often recommended due to a neurological medical problem like CCMs, or to developmental concerns, or due to cognitive decline. Cavernous malformations can affect neurological functioning, as I suspect most of us know, and potentially lead to cognitive, emotional, and behavioral changes. And a neuropsych evaluation can help document and understand those changes and help figure out how to cope with them. Better understanding of your unique strengths and weaknesses can be really helpful for both you and the people that you live with or you care about, because then you know where you need to focus and where you need help, and they do too, and that can make a huge difference in just your everyday, day-to-day interactions. And then they provide a ton of recommendations. So most neuropsych evaluations, if you read through them, they have all this sort of like information at the top, and then usually a bunch of scores at some point that don't mean a whole lot to most of us. And then at the end, they have like several pages of recommendations. So, we notice that you're having this sort of problem, and this sort of thing typically helps with that. So, that I think is the real reason I recommend neuropsych evaluations, because those recommendations are honed right into the kinds of problems that you're having, and they can really be incredibly helpful. So I thought it might be helpful to talk about what exactly happens during an evaluation. I know for some people that helps ease your mind if you're thinking about going in for one. They're not all exactly the same. This is what a typical neuropsych evaluation might look like. Some people might do things a little bit differently, but I'm going to guess most of them are going to look something like this. Usually they start with a clinical interview. Sometimes that is on the day of the evaluation, and sometimes it is a, a week before or 2 weeks before, just depending on the psychologist's preference and how they do their billing, et cetera. So, regardless, you've had a clinical interview. You've talked to them, they've asked a bunch of questions. They have a pretty good understanding of the kinds of things that you're concerned about, and they take that information and they decide what sorts of tests make sense to give you. And so they design a test battery specifically around the kinds of problems that you express that you're having. So on the day of the evaluation, you're going to go in and they're going to start presenting those tests to you. Some of those tests are probably going to be challenging, and some might seem really easy, and some will probably start out easy and get harder as you move through them. Usually the tests involve a test booklet where the evaluator is looking at questions. They may have you doing things with a paper and pencil, or putting pegs in a board, or lots of other different sorts of things. And they might also use a laptop or an iPad to administer the tests. The psychologist will take you through all of the steps. You just follow along. It shouldn't be super stressful for you. And you know what? It's likely that some of the things they ask you to do will be hard, and you'll be challenged. But I really would encourage you to try not to be embarrassed or frustrated if that happens, because the point is for them to understand where you're struggling. So if you don't struggle, it's really hard for them to get to that point, right? At some point, you probably will struggle, and that's okay. And I really don't want people to go into a psychological evaluation and feel like there's something wrong with them for not knowing how to do all this stuff. It's really the point of it, right? Um, the time can vary. So sometimes you're there all day. You might go in, do your clinical interview first thing, and then stay there all day, do all the testing, and then head home at the end. Sometimes they may break that into 3 sessions. So clinical interview day one, half day testing, and then a second half day of testing. It depends on a lot of different factors. So scheduling with the psychologist is one of those factors, but also patient fatigue matters a lot. So they may say, we're just going to break this up because they feel like you're going to have a hard time after a certain period. And so it makes sense to break it up. They really do want to see how you can, what you're really able to do. And so by the end of the day, if you're so tired you can't function, although that's important information, it doesn't really tell them what you're able to do under the best of circumstances. They will engage in behavioral observation. So they're going to watch how you react to challenges, and what do you do when things get frustrating? How do you interact with someone you've just met? What do you, when you have to find something in your bag, are you disorganized? Are you able to figure out where your things are? All of those sorts of things are, it's important information for the neuropsychologist. So they're keeping an eye on you throughout the evaluation. And then I have these next two highlighted very palely, so you might not see it, but they are. The next 2 steps are important, but they don't have anything to do with you. So you get to go home and the psychologist will score your tests and compare them against the norms. And then they'll interpret that information, interpret all the data. Usually they have tons of data, so they're taking all that in, looking at it, figuring out what kinds of recommendations make sense for you. And then they're going to usually write a report, a fairly comprehensive report, ideally. And then typically you would go back on another day for a feedback session. Generally speaking, that's a different day. I know very rarely they're done on the same day, but you can imagine figuring out, taking all that information and interpreting it takes some time. So usually that's on a separate day. And then you'll go in, they'll go through the report, go over all of the data, and then go through the recommendations and kind of explain why they've made those recommendations. So, typical day for an evaluation, that's what it's going to look like. They're going to look at a lot of different areas of functioning. So I sort of just made a list of the types of areas that they look at. Um, they will look at attention and concentration. I think a lot of us understand that cavernous malformations can affect those domains, which can make it difficult to focus, difficult to multitask. They can look at memory functioning. People with cavernous malformations often experience memory problems, both short and long-term memory. And the tests out there are really good at honing in on that so they can really get a better idea of where precisely your memory is struggling. And then planning and organizing and executive functions. Lots of us have trouble with those, which can lead to challenges with planning, problem solving, and organization. And cognitive flexibility. Lots of us experience difficulties adapting to changes, shifting attention, or switching between tasks. Mood changes. It's pretty common for people with cavernous malformations to experience depression or anxiety, and also to experience some trouble with emotional regulation, just having mood swings or emotional instability. So they can look at all those different domains and come up with some strategies that can be helpful. So, how do they know how your results compare in the grand scheme of things? I mentioned earlier these norms, normative data. And so, neuropsychology uses norms that are standardized data collected from a large and representative sample of people. They're used as a reference for comparison during a neuropsychological assessment. Norms serve as a baseline or standard against which an individual's performance on various cognitive tests can be compared. So, essentially, what happens is you're given a test, you get a score, and then at the back of those books that I was talking about earlier, there is pages and pages of numbers, and we find where you would fall, right? So, for instance, they're broken out in different ways. Some look at gender, some look at age, some look at um, educational level. And so you find where the particular person would fall in those tight tables, and you compare their score against that score in the table. Norms are standardized, and so is the administration of neuropsych tests. So when you are being administered a test, you might notice that they have very particular ways of saying things or doing things, and that's important because if one person tests one way and one person does it a totally different way, that affects the standardization, and then the norms are not as representative. So it's important that everything be done the same way every time. They're based on a representative sample, so ideally they're looking at people that represent population in terms of ethnicity and race and gender and age. They do often, as I mentioned, separate out by age, which makes sense. For instance, someone who's maybe 70 to 80 years old probably is going to have a different memory ability than someone who's 20 to 30 years old. So it is important to break out by age, and then they sometimes break out based on education and other demographics. Norms are periodically updated just to keep them fresh because the population is always changing, right? All right, so I just wanted to kind of show you the standard curve, the normal curve here. This is where the idea comes from, right, for these norms. And right in the middle is sort of what we're looking at. And most people don't fall directly in the middle, right? Although that is where the largest number would fall. But 68% of people fall close to the middle. And then as you go down and out a little bit, 95% of people will fall within this blue section, and 99% of people fall within the purple area. So looking at that normal distribution, that's how they get those norms in terms of figuring out what to compare your score against. So during a neuropsychological evaluation, a person's test scores are compared to the appropriate normative data. And then they look to see if there's a significant discrepancy between your performance and the norms, which could suggest a cognitive strength or weakness. And that's part of the interpretation. The neuropsychologists use their expertise to interpret those results in the context of your overall cognitive functioning and your clinical presentation. So it's they're looking at this very they're looking at all of the different pieces and bringing it together to make sense of how to best help you, your individual difficulties and where you're at in the world right now. So who does this? I mentioned the neuropsychologist earlier, and a neuropsychologist should always oversee the evaluation, but sometimes they have a psychometrist who administers the test. A psychometrist is typically someone who doesn't have a license to practice psychology. They might have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, and they've been trained pretty carefully in the administration of the test. So they're good at doing those standardized things that keep the test exactly as it's supposed to be. So they have typically, it can be done by a psychologist or a psychometrist, but the neuropsychologist is the person who should be interpreting those results. So a psychometrist can administer and score a test, but the neuropsychologist is the one who's doing the interpretation. A neuropsychologist, as I mentioned, is a psychologist with special training to better understand the brain. And not all neuropsychologists use a psychometrist. Many of them do administer the tests themselves. Why is a neuropsych evaluation potentially helpful? It can help in a lot of different ways. One of those being for diagnosis and treatment planning, so informing appropriate interventions and therapies. It can also help with a functional assessment, so understanding how your cognitive strengths and weaknesses impact your daily functioning. And then getting a baseline measurement, establishing that benchmark for tracking changes over time, that can be extremely helpful, particularly for those of us who potentially may have more problems over time. Getting that baseline can make a big difference. Because really, when you think about, we're comparing to those norms, right? But once you have a baseline, they're able to compare to your own norms. They're able to say, look, you improved, this score is better or this score is worse. Once you have that baseline, they can use you as the baseline instead of using those norms. And then in terms of education and psychoeducation, once you understand where your strengths and weaknesses lie, you can better understand what you need to do to improve, and also to be a little kinder to yourself, a little more gentle with yourself on areas where maybe you didn't understand you were struggling as much as you are. So I just wanted to go through some strategies that are potential recommendations. But first, I see a few questions in the Q&A. So let me see if we can hit those quickly before we hop into this next section. All right. All right, so the first question I'm seeing is, there aren't many neuropsychologists in my area. Is there an online service that crosses state lines? I believe there are. Before COVID, online neuropsych testing was not something that was terribly common, but it does seem to be something that's picking up steam. So certainly it's absolutely possible that there are neuropsychologists that cross state lines. I'm not sure what state you're in, but if you would like to send me an email, I can take a look and see if there is someone in your state, and I'll pop my email into the chat in a couple of minutes. All right, the next one is about depression. So this person has suffered depression for many years, but was only diagnosed with cavernous malformation when they were in their 70s. And they're wondering if this could have had an influence on the depression. That is a good question, and it's certainly possible. It's hard to know for sure, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibilities that um, that the depression was impacted by the cavernous malformation. Part of that would be where it's located, but uh, I'm going to say possibly. Um, should a person have several neuropsychological exams? Good question. Possibly. I can say having kids with neurological problems going up through school, my kids had a neuropsych eval every 2 to 3 years, more frequently when they had problems. So if they had a bleed or a change, or we noticed something was off, we would schedule a neuropsych eval for them. I would say as adults, you should get I would encourage people to get a baseline. I think having a baseline can be really helpful. So getting that initial evaluation and then getting updated evaluations if there's a change. Typically, it would be very unusual to have more than one in a year, but beyond that, it's not unusual to have one once a year if you're having increased symptoms. Um, although I would say most adults don't need that. All right, I hope that answered your question. What if you have more than one issue, CCM and learning disabilities, or CCM and Alzheimer's, or something else like that? How do they distinguish between the results? I think that's a very interesting question, and my answer would be it probably doesn't matter. Their goal is to figure out where your strengths and weaknesses are and then help you figure out some coping strategies for them. And so it might matter to us, like, is this my brain thing or is this my learning disability thing? But in terms of the coping skills or the strategies to help you, it probably doesn't make a difference most of the time. So they probably aren't going to worry about distinguishing. Sometimes, though, for folks like us with, clear brain issues, they may look at your MRI and say, like, oh, you have this lesion in this area and you have this problem. They're probably related. Okay, this person has looked for memory therapy in California, and they've only ever found therapy for Alzheimer's. Can you recommend a neuropsychologist for memory? I would say if there is someone who specializes in Alzheimer's, they may be helpful to you. I don't know if you've actually tried that or not. Sometimes I think we get really caught up in, seeing the very specialized specialist, but our disease is very rare. There are not people that focus on what we have. Um, there certainly are neuropsychologists that focus on memory. Yeah, if you want to send me a message, I can try to see if I can find someone out your way, but you may find if you haven't already talked to the Alzheimer's therapist that they can be helpful to you. Uh, yes, indeed, it's hard to find providers when you're in the great wilderness of Australia, I'm sure. All right, this person has a lesion in their amygdala, and they have had 2 left temporal lobe bleeds. They're wondering if those locations can cause extreme mood disturbances. Yeah, certainly possible that that mood disturbances are related. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Um, I'm going to hop back in. You guys can put more questions in the Q&A and we'll circle back to them at the end. And only real quick, I'm going to just put my email in the chat. it is there. So I wanted to just sort of talk about some different types of cognitive strategies. And we talk about a lot of these in support group. Um, and certainly it's wise to go see a neuropsychologist, figure out where you need help, and then work on those areas. But I just wanted to sort of talk about some of the general things that they might recommend. So, in terms of memory, things that a lot of these we used to do in school, right? Mnemonic techniques, that's a hard word. Organizational strategies, repetition, writing things down can be helpful. Writing things down can be helpful in two ways. It can sort of trigger a different memory piece, and also you then have it written down, right? So you can look back at it. So um, I encourage people who have memory challenges to carry a little notebook and pen and just jot things down, um, and try really hard to stop telling yourself that you're going to remember, because the reality is that there's a good chance you're not going to remember, and it's really okay. Write it down, give yourself some grace, and just jot it down so you can go back to it later if it's important. Um, Things that can help with attention and focus, practicing mindfulness, eliminating distractions, breaking tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks can be helpful. Um, a good example is if you see, if your room is really messy and you're having trouble figuring out where to start, picking one chunk, like I'm going to deal with all the trash, and then I'm going to deal with any dirty laundry. Then I'm going to take out any dishes or whatever things need to be done in your particular space. But thinking about one of those chunks at a time rather than the whole task can really help you focus and reduce that feeling of overwhelm. Just circling back really quickly to mindfulness, we talk about mindfulness a whole lot in support groups. It can be, it's something that you can find readily on YouTube if you search mindfulness or guided relaxation techniques. There are people that will talk you through it. I strongly recommend listening to a few and deciding which one you like, because my personal preference is some people's voices just get on my nerves. So I like to listen to a couple and decide which one is, more soothing to me. But I will say that relaxation and mindfulness is a skill. Just like any other skill, you need to practice it. So if you try to do a mindfulness exercise and you can only focus for 2 minutes, that's okay. Try again and find short ones if you know that that's a problem. Find ones that are only, 5 minutes to start with, and then try to focus for 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, and work your way up. It's it's really a skill, and you wouldn't expect yourself to have any other skill immediately. Just because this one lives in your head doesn't mean that it's something that you should automatically be able to do. So, if you're training to run a marathon, you don't go out there and run the marathon the first day, right? So be patient with yourself, give yourself grace, but do practice that mindfulness, because it is incredibly important and really can be very helpful for folks with brain challenges. Another thing that we can do is modify your environment. So simplifying the environment by doing things like minimizing clutter, minimizing distractions, creating a more organized and focused space. Those things can all be helpful. And then visual supports can be really helpful. And I'm a big fan of visual supports. And quite frankly, will tell you that I have no qualms about sticking them up all over my house. This is my house, this is where I live. And if that means that I have to have a great big calendar somewhere that maybe looks a little gaudy, I'm fine with that because I need it. And that's just how life is right now. So using things like calendars, to-do lists, and reminders to assist with that planning and organization can be really helpful. Putting a little note, if you're trying to learn a new routine, putting a little note somewhere where you'll see it. Putting a note on your front doors of those, like, don't forget your keys, your phone, your wallet, whatever those things you need to remember as you're walking out the door. Stick a little note on your door. It is absolutely okay and perfectly reasonable, and it will make a difference in terms of reducing that frustration day to day when you get where you're going and realize you don't have your phone. There's lots of things that we can use now in terms of assistive technology. So there's a ton of apps available on our phones, and I feel like a lot of us are not using those as effectively as we could. Um, I know my daughter has a really hard time drinking water, so we're always looking for apps that remind her to drink water. Plant Nanny, like a nanny for plants, has been a really helpful app because you have to remember to water the plants. You have to remember to drink your water, and if you don't, your plants die. You can use voice recorders so you can listen to things again, similar to what I was saying earlier, just writing things down. A reminder system, a lot of our phones have those, and a lot of us have smart devices in our home, like Alexas or Google Homes. Those will allow you to put a reminder into them that happens regularly or once, for those one-off things that you want to remember. I have a reminder that goes off every morning at 9 a.m. and reminds me to take my morning medicine. If I don't dismiss it, it will go off again an hour later. It will go off all day until I do what I'm supposed to do. And at some point, I will get so annoyed that I do it if I have not done it yet. Usually I have. There's also some adaptive devices like speech to text software or magnification tools, and those things can all be really helpful. So I would just encourage you, if you know you're struggling with certain things, to look at what's out there. There's a lot of tools out there in the world that might be really helpful. So certainly feel free and ask on our Facebook groups, because there's oftentimes people have already looked into this stuff and have great suggestions. So that's another good resource. Um, Looking at your lifestyle factors can also be worthwhile, encouraging healthy habits like regular exercise, balanced nutrition, getting enough sleep, managing your stress. Those things are all really important just for overall brain health. And then doing things to stimulate your brain, like puzzles, reading, learning new skills. I know one of our friends from support group is really fond of word puzzles and playing Scrabble online. All those things are great for your brain. So, doing things that are fun but also stimulating can be helpful. And then emotional support like therapy and counseling can be definitely worth doing to address emotional challenges and develop coping strategies. And then support groups like we have shortly coming up give you a chance to connect with individuals facing similar challenges for emotional support. In terms of self care, working on reducing stress, I know that's sort of easier to say than to do when you're dealing with, kind of scary illness, but you certainly can learn some techniques that can be helpful, like deep breathing, exercising, mindfulness. They can all help manage stress. And then time management, like learning to establish routines, prioritizing tasks, allocating time effectively. I suspect that there are a lot of folks joining us tonight that struggle with that time management piece. So certainly there are tools out there. There's a ton of really great apps to help build routines, and they teach you how to link them. So you take a habit that you already have and you link another habit to it, and then you can kind of keep linking. So for instance, if every day I get up and brush my teeth, I link taking my pills to brushing my teeth. So as soon as I brush my teeth, I take my medicine, and then I link something else to taking my medicine once that habit is ingrained. And you can kind of keep moving that link on until you have a really nice solid morning routine. So there are lots of really great things out there, and I would encourage you to give them a try, check them out, but also go see someone and find out what you really need to work on, and then you can kind of focus your thoughts in that area. All right, that is all I had planned. Let me hop on to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I don't have to look at that screen all day, and I'm going to see if there's any more questions. This person is saying the neurologist Won't manage medications for anxiety or depression. If someone is suffering, who should manage these medications? That's a great question. I think it depends on a lot of factors. So in some cases, you're just your regular, I want to say your pediatrician, but that's because I have children. That's the doctor we go to the most. Just your regular PCP will manage those medications a lot of the time. If, however, your case is a little more complex, they may want you to see a psychiatrist. That's who manages those medicines the majority of the time. Most psychologists are not trained and also not licensed to administer medications. So it would generally need to come from either your PCP, a psychiatrist, or there are a fair few nurse practitioners that practice in the psych domain, and they would also be probably pretty good at managing those medications. Also, I will say some neurologists are more than happy to manage those medications. So if you're not married to your neurologist, you might want to see if there's someone that's a better fit that would help you with those. Someone is asking about support groups. Can I share more about the support groups? Yes, absolutely. We have support groups through the Alliance twice a week, Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern and Mondays at noon Eastern. And the support groups are very casual. We have a group of, it depends how many people come, but I would say typically 10 to 20 folks joining us, and we talk about whatever people need to talk about at that moment. So sometimes it's more just questions about, like, I heard this about cavernous malformations, or I heard that, or I want to learn a little more. I want more details about things. So sometimes that's where we spend a lot of time, and other times it's on, someone's newly diagnosed and they're scared or they're having surgery, and we do a lot of support and comforting when that's happening. And um, overall, I would say that they're a pretty nice group, and I'm very fond of everyone that comes. And I know that some of you are in here, so if you want to pop into the chat, anything else about support group, feel free. All right, mindfulness. Do I have any tips on how to do this in hospital um, or in procedure cases, for example, MRIs? I do. I actually, so so backing up 2 steps, you need to have the skill before you go in for the MRI or whatever test you're having, right? So remember that it's a skill. Certainly you can practice, you can listen to an audio or something like that and do your best to practice along. But if that's your first time ever meditating and you're stressed and MRIs are loud, so it's banging around, and it's sort of like setting yourself up to have a really hard time with it because you kind of placed yourself in a difficult situation. So I would encourage you to practice the skill at a time when you're able to really focus on it, get that down, and then you'll have a much easier time meditating in that moment. I'm pretty good at a couple of different, like I'm a deep breather. That's where I focus the best. So when I'm doing an MRI, I do some counting meditations. This is a really easy one. I'll go over super quick, that you can do anywhere, and you don't need anything. You don't need to listen to anything. It's just all happening in your own head. So I call it the just meditation. So you say to yourself, just one, just two, just three, and then you repeat. And so you breathe in while you're thinking the word just, and you breathe out while you're thinking the number, and you breathe in, just, and then breathe out on two, and then breathe in, just, and breathe out on three. It is very hard to explain it with the breathing at the same time. So hopefully I did an okay job, but if I didn't, I can try to write it out because it is a little bit difficult to explain while I am breathing and talking at the same time. I hope that was helpful, but if it wasn't, if you need more tips, feel free to reach out. And I will also say a lot of times MRIs are able to hook you up with, um, they're piping sound through. So you might ask if they can put a meditation into into your sort of headphones or whatever it is you're using to listen during your MRI or whatever, if it's a different kind of test, you may be able to just turn it on your phone. That's what I used to do when I would get acupuncture. I would just put my phone up near me and throw on a short meditation to listen to. All right. Yes, Monday group has started back up. Monday group is active. We're doing Mondays. Yes. CAUK has another good support group. And Jeff, if you want to pop the info for that into the chat, that would be great. CAUK absolutely does have some great support groups. All right, another question. Do you recommend getting a baseline neuropsych evaluation before a bleed? Would this actually help a future neuropsych evaluation? Yes, if you can. It would be very wise to do it. I think a lot of us don't do that because we don't want to think about the fact that we could have a problem in the future, but certainly would be a good thing to have. The difficulty is a lot of insurances are not going to pay for an evaluation if you're not having problems. However, if you can make it work, I think as someone who's done testing, if I had that baseline of before the bleed to look at, it would make it a lot easier to understand how that bleed affected your brain functioning. All right. We are getting out of questions. I'm just scrolling through them. I think we answered that one. Someone is saying they'd like to put a plug in for support group. Thank you. Support group is great. It is a fantastic group. And as previously mentioned, I'm very fond of all of you. All right. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. I know we have some people looking for the support group link. And so while you guys are working on a couple more questions, if you have them, I will go grab that link and drop it in. All right. I will put my email in the chat again. It probably got buried. Oh, that link might be a little bit wonky. It came from the Facebook event, and sometimes that makes them weird. All right, I just put my email address in there again. Hey, Joe. And I'm going to see if I can get a link that looks a little bit less wonky. See how we feel about this one. That looks better. All right. Hopefully you can find my email in the chat. Oh, good question, Allison. How do we find our own support? So the question is, how do those of us who run the support groups get our own support? I feel like I get a lot of support from you guys during support group, and I also have a strong family connection, so I get some support there too. And I try really hard to remember to practice what I preach and take care of myself and do all those self-care things. It is really easy to say those things and not always as easy to do them in real life. So So I try to do what I suggest that everybody else does, and I work hard at it, but I don't always get it right. All right. So type Cavernoma Alliance UK and it should come up with the necessary information is the recommendation about how to find the CA UK support group information. All right. I think we're done with that one. Oh, thank you. It is in the Q&A, so I'm going to move it over to the chat so y'all can see it. And for those watching after the fact, it is cavernoma.org.uk. Thanks, Susie. And Jeff, thank you too. All right. Can I provide my email? Yes, I can. It is darla@alliancetocure.org. DARLA and then alliancetocure.org. Sorry if it's not coming up. It is, the chat is busy. You guys are chatting. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up? Thanks for putting that in the chat, Susie. All right. I think we are wrapping up a little bit early, which is not typical. So we all have a few minutes before support group starts. So grab a glass of water and, you have time to do a 5-minute meditation. So mindfulness. Does everybody have the link that needs it? It should be. Let me see. Are you guys not seeing what I post? Let me try again. No, I don't think you are seeing what I post. I apologize. Let me go track it down again. All right. Putting it in the chat. You guys see it? And I'm going to put my email in the chat again. I think you should see it. Oh. No problem, Elizabeth. Hang on, there's a couple more questions. Yep. Sorry, guys, that was my fault. I had it set to only be able to message myself, which was not helpful to you at all. So I apologize for that. So we have a couple of minutes. Take a few minutes, do some self-care, and hopefully I'll see a lot of you guys in support group in 10 minutes or so. Take care.